Jack was walking down the quiet street, his backpack bouncing lightly against his back, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. He was almost home when he heard the screeching of tires. It was a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the usual hum of cars passing by. It was sharp, desperate, and filled with panic. Instinctively, he turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the road ahead. It took only a moment for him to see the car swerving wildly back and forth across the street, the driver struggling to regain control. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew it wasn't good. He could see the car's wheels slip off the edge of the road, the driver fighting to steer as it slid uncontrollably toward the sidewalk. In that instant, Jack's legs moved before his mind could catch up with them. His feet were already running toward the danger before he even knew what he planned to do. His heart raced as his thoughts scrambled to process the situation. Was there anyone else around? Did anyone else see what was happening? He didn't stop to check. He didn't even think twice. He just ran. The noise of the tires skidding echoed in his ears. As he sprinted toward the car slammed into a tree with a sickening crunch. The force of the impact made Jack stumble to a halt, his eyes locked on the wreckage in front of him. Smoke was already rising from the hood of the car, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. The air seemed to thicken around him, and for a brief moment time itself felt like it slowed down. The world became distant and surreal, but then he snapped back into focus. The car was still moving slightly as it settled against the tree, the engine sputtering and smoking as the air grew thicker with each passing second. The scene was chaotic. The car was mangled, its front end crumpled as if it had been crushed by the force of the impact. But what struck Jack most was the figure inside the car. The driver was slumped over the wheel, their face hidden, but their body was unmoving. Jack's heart lurched at the sight. He could see the stranger was in trouble. The smoke around the car was thickening fast, and the sound of the engine was getting quieter, as if the car was dying. But the driver was still there, still breathing, or at least Jack hoped. So without a second thought, Jack pushed forward. He knew he had to act fast. He had to help. He could already feel the heat from the engine in the air. As he neared the wreckage, the smoke stung his eyes. But he didn't care. He needed to get to the person inside. He needed to make sure they were alive. Jack reached the driver's side and saw the door was jammed. The metal was twisted and bent in a way that made it impossible to open, but he didn't stop to think about how hard it would be. He couldn't waste time trying to figure out how to open the door. He knew there was no time. The smoke was thick now, and Jack's lungs burned from the fumes. As he crouched down beside the car, he tried the handle anyway. It was stuck. He tried pulling harder, but it wouldn't budge. Jack cursed under his breath, desperation clawing at him. He had to do something. The door wouldn't open, and the smoke was getting worse. He could hear the faint sound of the driver's labored breathing, and it urged him on. His thoughts were a blur of confusion and fear, but the need to act was stronger than anything else. The sound of the tires screeching and the car slamming into the tree played over and over in his head, but he couldn't afford to think about that now. He had to focus on the task in front of him. It was the only thing that mattered. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the wrecked car. The door was jammed shut, and the smoke from the engine was growing thicker by the second. He could feel the heat from the car pressing against him. Like a wall, the acrid smell of burning rubber and metal filled his nostrils. But he didn't hesitate. He knew he had to act quickly. Every second counted. As he knelt beside the wrecked vehicle, he could see the driver's chest barely rising and falling as they struggled to breathe. Their face was obscured by the airbag and the steering wheel, but Jack could see enough to know that they were in trouble. The sight made his stomach churn, but he pushed the fear down. The driver was alive, and that was all that mattered. He couldn't waste time hesitating. Jack's hand gripped the metal frame of the car. The smoke stung his eyes and made it hard to see, but he could hear the driver's labored breaths, each one growing weaker with every passing moment. Jack had to get them out of there. He had to help them somehow. Jack glanced around for anything that could help him. There had to be something nearby, something he could use to break the door open. He spotted a large rock on the side of the road, and without thinking twice he dashed over and grabbed it. His fingers tightened around the rough surface of the rock as he ran back to the car, his legs burning with each step. He reached the driver's side again and raised the rock above his head. With all his might, he slammed it into the window. The glass shattered in a sharp explosion of sound, the pieces falling in all directions. But the opening was small, barely big enough for his hand to reach through. But Jack didn't care. The driver needed him, and that was all that mattered. He reached through the broken window and unlocked the door, his fingers trembling as he did it. With a swift motion, he pulled the door open. The hinges creaked in protest, but the door was finally free. He took a deep breath and leaned inside, trying to get a better look at the driver. The stranger was still breathing, but their movements were slow and weak. Jack could see their head lolling to one side. Their eyes were closed, and they weren't responding to his voice. Jack called out to them, but they didn't react. Their body was limp in the seat. But Jack couldn't give up. He reached inside the car and gently shook the driver's shoulder, hoping to get some response. At first nothing happened, but then the stranger's eyes flickered open, and they looked at him with confusion and fear. Jack felt a small sense of relief, but the stranger's face quickly contorted in pain. Jack's eyes widened. He could see the blood on their shirt and the twisted angle of their leg. The driver had clearly been injured, but Jack couldn't focus on that now. He needed to keep them conscious, keep them talking. He had to help them through this. Jack crouched down next to the driver and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Don't worry, help is on the way. I called 911. They'll be here soon," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. But he knew the stranger could hear him. The driver's eyes blinked slowly, as if they were struggling to process his words, but they managed to nod slightly. Jack kept talking, even though he wasn't sure if the driver could hear him. He told them to stay with him, to stay awake, and not to fall asleep. Jack's mind was racing. The time felt like it was slipping away, but he refused to give in to panic. The stranger's life was in his hands, and he wouldn't let go of that responsibility. Jack didn't know how long it would take for help to arrive, but he knew he couldn't leave the driver's side, not until they were safe. He stayed by their side, talking to them gently, his words a lifeline in the chaos around them. Jack felt the heat of the car pressing against him, the smoke swirling around him, making his throat itch and his eyes water. But he couldn't look away from the stranger in the seat beside him. The driver's face was pale, their eyes half-lidded, but they were still breathing, and Jack clung to that small bit of hope. He kept talking to them in a soft voice. "Don't worry, I'm right here. Just stay with me," he said, his voice breaking through the fog of panic that had started to cloud his mind. He kept his hand on the stranger's shoulder, making sure they could feel his presence and that they weren't alone. The driver's eyes flickered open again, but they looked confused, almost like they didn't recognize where they were or what had happened. Jack could see the fear in their eyes, the fear that mirrored his own, but he couldn't let that show. He had to be strong. He had to keep them calm. Jack's mind raced as he searched for a way to help, but the options seemed so limited. The driver's body was slumped awkwardly in the seat, their leg twisted at an unnatural angle, and Jack could see the dark stain of blood spreading on their shirt. He knew the injuries were serious, but there was nothing he could do to fix them, not without proper medical help. He couldn't stop the bleeding, and he couldn't move the driver without risking more damage. But he knew he couldn't just sit there and wait either. He had to keep them awake, keep them talking. He tried to focus on anything he could do, something simple, something that might make a difference. "Just stay with me, okay? Don't close your eyes," he said again, trying to keep the stranger conscious. The driver's lips parted, and Jack could hear them try to speak, but their voice was weak and rasping. It was barely a whisper, but Jack leaned in close, straining to hear anything they might say. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently. He needed to hear their voice, anything to keep them grounded. But the stranger didn't answer. At first their eyes fluttered closed again, but Jack shook his head gently. "No, don't fall asleep. Stay awake, please. Just tell me your name." Jack tried again, and this time the driver's lips parted slightly. Jack felt his heart jump as they spoke so faintly it was almost inaudible. Their voice barely a murmur, but it was enough. Jack breathed a sigh of relief. At least they had spoken. At least he knew they could hear him. He held on to that tiny spark of hope and tried again. "My name is Jack. I'm right here. Just stay with me." Jack said, his voice steady, now more confident. He needed to keep them calm, needed to make sure they didn't slip away. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, But he refused to let himself panic. Not now, not when the driver needed him. Jack glanced around desperately, his eyes searching for any sign of help. But there was nothing. Not yet. He knew the paramedics had to be on their way, but time seemed to stretch on endlessly. In those moments, the smoke around them thickened, the heat from the engine still unbearable, and Jack had to fight to keep his breath steady, his lungs burning with every inhale. The minutes felt like hours as he stayed by the driver's side, his hand on their shoulder, keeping them grounded to the present, to the fight for survival. Jack knew they couldn't afford to fall asleep. They couldn't afford to slip into unconsciousness. He couldn't let them go. Jack kept talking to them, his voice the only steady thing in the chaos around them. It was like an anchor holding them both steady in the storm of panic and confusion. But the minutes dragged on, and Jack started to wonder how long it would take for the emergency responders to arrive. He felt helpless, but he refused to give in. He wouldn't leave the driver's side, not until help was here. He focused on their breathing and on keeping them awake, on every word that came from his mouth, reminding them that they weren't alone and that help was on the way. Jack's heart continued to pound as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The heat from the car was unbearable, and the smoke clouded everything. But he didn't look away from the stranger. Their breathing was shallow but steady, and Jack clung to that hope as if it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. The stranger's eyes fluttered open again, and this time they focused on Jack. With a sense of recognition, he could see the confusion in their eyes, but also a glimmer of relief as they locked onto his gaze. Jack's voice was the only sound in the chaos. "Stay with me," he said, his words barely above a whisper, but they were all that mattered. He couldn't afford to let the stranger slip away. The driver blinked slowly, trying to focus on him. Jack could feel the tension in the air. It was thick and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He held his breath as he waited for the driver to speak, but the words never came. Instead, the stranger's face twisted in pain, and they let out a soft groan. Jack's stomach turned. He could see that the injuries were worse than he had originally thought. Blood stained the driver's shirt, and their leg was bent at an odd angle. The sight made Jack's throat tighten, but he refused to look away. He had to keep it together. He had to stay strong for both of them. Jack's hand tightened around the stranger's shoulder as he tried to keep them conscious. "Look at me," he said softly, his voice firm. "You're going to be okay. Just stay awake. Help is coming." It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer right now. The driver's lips parted again, but no words came out, only a weak breath that rattled in their chest. Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept talking. He kept reassuring the stranger. With every word he spoke, he could feel the tremor in his own hands, but he didn't let it show. He kept his focus on the driver's face, on their shallow breathing, on the slight rise and fall of their chest. "Stay with me," Jack said again, his voice steady but urgent. The driver's eyes flickered to him, but they didn't respond, their eyelids heavy as if they were fighting the pull of sleep. Jack's own heart was racing faster now as he realized just how close they were to losing consciousness. It wasn't the time for panic. He couldn't afford to let fear take over. Not now, with the stranger's life hanging in the balance. He reached inside the car and gently shook the driver's shoulder again, trying to rouse them. "Don't close your eyes," he whispered urgently. "Just stay with me." The driver didn't respond, and Jack felt a stab of panic pierce through him. But he fought it down. He couldn't let himself get lost in fear, not when the stranger needed him so desperately. His breath came in shallow gasps as he leaned in closer. "Stay awake," he said, his voice a little more forceful. "Don't fall asleep. Not yet, please." Jack had never been so terrified in his life, but he couldn't show it. He had to stay calm for the driver. He had to keep talking. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but they still felt too far away, too slow. Jack's fingers tightened around the driver's shoulder again as he spoke in a soft but firm voice. "I'm right here," he said. "You're not alone. Help is coming soon. Just stay with me." The minutes felt like a lifetime as Jack stayed there, with the stranger keeping them awake and alert, his own body tense and aching. But he refused to leave their side, not even for a second. The air around them was growing thicker, the smoke still pouring from the wreckage, and Jack could feel the weight of it pressing on him. But he couldn't look away. He couldn't let the stranger slip into unconsciousness. He could feel the driver's pulse under his fingers, faint but steady. He just had to keep them awake just a little longer, and the paramedics would be there to take over. But until then, Jack was all they had, and he wouldn't give up. The sound of the sirens was getting louder, but Jack couldn't tell if it was getting closer or if time was just stretching endlessly in his mind. The smoke was thick now, and the heat from the car pressed against him like an invisible wall. He could barely see the road around them, but his focus never wavered from the driver. He had to keep them awake. He had to keep talking to them. Jack's hand was still on their shoulder, and he could feel the faint pulse under his fingertips. It was steady but weak. Their breathing was shallow and slow. Jack had no idea how much longer they could hold on, but he wasn't going to let them go. He wasn't going to lose them. Not like this. He stayed there beside the car, leaning in close as he whispered words of encouragement. "Don't give up. I'm right here. Just stay awake," he said, his voice firm but gentle. He could feel the driver's body tremble and knew that their strength was fading. But Jack wouldn't let them slip away. He refused to let that happen. The smoke stung his eyes and burned his throat, but he ignored it. The only thing that mattered was keeping the stranger conscious, keeping them alive. Jack's heart raced as he watched their eyelids flutter. The driver's face was pale, and their expression was twisted in pain. Jack hated seeing them like this, but he wouldn't stop. He wouldn't give up on them. He shook the driver's shoulder gently again. "Don't close your eyes. Stay with me," he said, his voice rising a little bit in desperation. The driver didn't respond. Their eyelids were heavy, and their breathing sounded labored. Jack felt a surge of fear flood through him, but he fought it back. He couldn't let himself panic. He had to stay calm. He had to keep them calm, keep them focused. Jack's mind raced as he tried to think of anything else he could do, but all he could do was talk, keep them awake, keep them from losing consciousness. He kept whispering words of comfort to the stranger, even though he wasn't sure they could hear him. "Just stay with me," he said quietly. "Help is almost here. They'll be here soon. You're going to be okay." Jack didn't know if he believed his own words, but he had to say them. He had to give the driver something to hold on to. His fingers dug into their shoulder as he continued to shake them. Gently, "Don't fall asleep," he whispered. "Stay with me." The sirens were so close now. Jack could hear the sound of the fire trucks and ambulances, but it still felt like an eternity before they would reach him. The air around them was thick with smoke, and Jack could feel his own chest tightening as he breathed in the fumes. But he couldn't leave the stranger's side. Not now, not when they needed him the most. His mind flashed back to the crash, the sound of the tires screeching, and the sickening thud of the car hitting the tree. It had all happened so fast, and now here he was holding on to the last bit of hope that he could make a difference, that he could save this stranger's life. Jack didn't know what had happened to the driver or how badly they were injured, but he knew that they couldn't survive much longer without help. The thought was terrifying, but he refused to let it take over. He couldn't let himself think like that. He had to stay focused. He had to believe that the paramedics would get there in time. Jack didn't know how long he had been sitting there beside the car, holding onto the driver's shoulder, but it felt like forever. The sirens were almost deafening now, and Jack knew the help he had been waiting for was finally here, but it was still hard to believe that they were going to be okay. He stayed by their side, his voice never wavering as he kept talking to them, his hand still on their shoulder. Even as the paramedics rushed to the scene, Jack couldn't help but feel a rush of relief as the first responders arrived. He knew they were here to take over, but he wasn't ready to let go, not yet. The sound of the sirens had finally reached its peak, and Jack could hear the rush of footsteps coming closer. The paramedics arrived with urgency, but Jack couldn't pull himself away. He stayed by the driver's side, his hand still gripping their shoulder, even though he knew it was time to let them take over. He didn't want to let go, not after everything he had done to keep them awake, to keep them alive. Jack's breath was shallow, his chest tight with the weight of the situation. The paramedics moved in quickly. Two of them crouched by the car, while another took a brief moment to assess the scene. One of them glanced at Jack with an expression of gratitude, but also concern. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. Jack nodded quickly, but his voice was tight. "I'm fine, just don't let them fall asleep," he said, his words almost desperate. "Don't let them go." The paramedic nodded as they worked, pulling open the door with the help of their partner and shifting the driver into a safer position. Jack could see the bloodstains on the stranger's shirt and the way their leg was bent unnaturally, But the paramedics didn't hesitate. They moved with practiced precision. One of them took the driver's pulse and nodded in relief. "They're stable for now," he said to the other paramedics. Jack could feel a rush of relief flood through him, but the fear still lingered in his chest. He wasn't sure if the stranger was out of danger, yet the other paramedic turned to Jack. "Are you sure you're okay?" they asked again. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. He nodded again, but his head was spinning. His hands were shaking as he took a step back to give the professionals room to work. The paramedics began to carefully assess the driver's injuries, speaking calmly to each other as they prepared to stabilize them. Jack watched every movement with wide eyes. Even though the panic in his chest had started to settle, it was still hard to believe this was real. It had all happened so fast. The crash, the smoke, the fear. He glanced at the stranger's face again and saw that their eyes were closed, but their chest was still rising and falling. Jack held his breath, waiting to see if they would stay that way as the paramedics carefully secured the driver with straps and lifted them into the stretcher. Jack stepped back even farther, his legs feeling like jelly under him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the driver. He couldn't let go. Yet the paramedics began to wheel the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance. Jack followed them for a few steps before stopping to catch his breath. He didn't even realize how tightly he had been gripping his backpack until his hands loosened and the weight of his own body hit him. All at once the adrenaline was wearing off and Jack suddenly felt the exhaustion flood through him. The sound of the ambulance doors closing seemed to bring everything into sharper focus. He felt a wave of dizziness pass over him, but he fought it off as he looked up at the paramedics standing by the ambulance. "We've got them," he said. One of the paramedics said in a reassuring tone. "They'll be fine. You did a good job here." Jack didn't know what to say. He felt a mix of relief and disbelief, but the weight of the moment was finally starting to hit him. He had acted without thinking, without hesitation, and now the stranger was in the hands of people who could save them. Jack felt the tightness in his chest begin to ease as he finally allowed himself to breathe deeply. He had done everything he could, and now it was in the hands of the paramedics. But still something gnawed at him. Had he done enough? Was the stranger really going to be okay? Jack didn't know the answers, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that there was hope. He watched as the ambulance pulled away from the wreckage, and his legs finally gave way beneath him. He sank down onto the pavement, his hands shaking, but his heart feeling lighter than it had in hours. Jack sat there on the pavement for a long moment, his body still trembling from the adrenaline, his mind racing with questions he didn't have the answers to. He couldn't stop thinking about the driver. What had happened to them? Were they really going to be okay? Had he done enough to save them? The thought of everything that had just happened felt surreal, like it hadn't truly sunk in. Yet Jack could hear the distant hum of the emergency vehicles as they moved away, but the scene in front of him felt like it was frozen in time. The twisted wreckage of the car still sitting by the side of the road, as a reminder of how close he had come to losing the stranger. The weight of it all settled heavily on his shoulders. But Jack couldn't allow himself to stay like this, not when there was still so much uncertainty running through his mind. He finally pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, as if they had forgotten how to support him. He took a deep breath and wiped his face with his sleeve. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he could feel the sweat drying on his skin and the burn of exhaustion in his muscles. He had acted quickly and decisively when the crash first happened, but now that everything was over, it was hard to process just how much he had been through. Jack walked slowly toward the wrecked car, his eyes falling on the broken window and the scorched metal. He had barely noticed the damage at first, but now that the danger had passed, he could see the full extent of the destruction. The car was a mangled mess of twisted metal and shattered glass, and the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't acted so quickly made his stomach churn. The crash had been a violent one, and the stranger had been lucky to be alive. Jack knew that now. He looked back at the road where the paramedics had taken the driver and felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt, like he had done something right, but not enough. He turned away from the wreckage and walked a few steps toward the shoulder of the road, his eyes scanning the empty street. He felt like he was in a daze. Everything around him seemed far away and muffled, as if he were trapped in some kind of fog. His thoughts were jumbled and chaotic, But there was one thing that stood out above everything else, the feeling of responsibility that had consumed him from the moment he had seen the wreckage. He had done what he could to help, but there was still so much uncertainty about the stranger's fate. Jack had no idea how serious their injuries were or if they would even survive, but he couldn't help but hope that his actions had made a difference. Maybe the paramedics had gotten there in time. Maybe he had been the one to pull them back from the edge. Jack wasn't sure, but what he did know was that he had acted when it mattered the most. He hadn't hesitated when the crash happened. He hadn't run away from the danger. He had rushed in, even though every instinct in his body was telling him to stay back. He had kept calm and kept the stranger conscious through it all. And for that he knew he had done the right thing, even if the outcome wasn't certain. Jack started walking again, this time with a purpose, his steps more confident as he moved toward the intersection at the end of the road. He wasn't sure where he was going or what he was going to do next, but for the first time in hours he didn't feel completely lost. He had taken control of the situation when it mattered most, and no matter what happened next, he knew he had given that stranger a fighting chance. Jack didn't stop walking until he reached the bus stop on the corner. He sat down on the bench and let out a long breath, the tension in his body finally beginning to ease, but his mind was still racing. He had never been in a situation like this before, and he didn't know how to make sense of it all. He had just helped save a life, and now he was left with nothing but questions. The one thing he knew for sure was that he wouldn't forget this day, not for as long as he lived. It had changed something inside him, made him realize how fragile life was, and how important it was to act when it mattered most. Jack sat on the bench, staring out at the quiet street, his thoughts a swirl of emotions and memories that he wasn't sure how to process. The crash felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, but the images were still vivid in his mind. The sight of the car, the smoke, the sound of the impact, and the way the driver had looked when he first saw them. Jack rubbed his hands over his face, trying to clear his thoughts, but the weight of everything seemed impossible to escape. Even now, hours later, as he sat there trying to make sense of the day, everything seemed surreal. He had never imagined himself in a situation like that. He had never pictured himself rushing into danger to help a stranger, yet here he was replaying every moment in his mind, wondering if he could have done more, if there was something he missed, maybe if he had acted a second sooner, or if he had known more about first aid. Could he have saved them completely? Jack pushed the thought aside, but it lingered like a shadow hanging over him. No matter how many times he tried to shake it off, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was somehow responsible for the outcome. Still, the exhaustion from everything began to settle in his body, and for the first time since the crash, he allowed himself to feel it, his muscles aching from the tension he had carried all day, his head pounding from the stress. But even as his body ached, he couldn't stop thinking about the stranger. The paramedics had taken them away, but Jack had no idea what had happened after that. Were they going to be okay? Had he really made a difference, or had he just been lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time? Jack wasn't sure how long he had been sitting on the bench when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw a figure walking toward him. It was a woman in her late 20s with short brown hair and a kind face. She was walking slowly, as if uncertain about something. Jack blinked, trying to focus on her, but his mind was still foggy from everything that had happened. She stopped in front of him and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jack stood up quickly, almost instinctively, his heart racing for a moment, wondering if something else had gone wrong. But then she spoke again. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. Jack blinked, trying to process her words. "Thank me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. He had no idea who she was or why she was thanking him. The woman smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm the one who was driving the car," she said, her voice trembling a little. Jack felt a wave of shock hit him like a sudden gust of wind. He stared at her for a moment, his mouth going dry, as the realization sank in. You're the one," he stammered. The woman nodded. "I'm okay," she said with a small but reassuring smile. "I was in bad shape when the paramedics took me away, but they told me I'd be fine. I just wanted to thank you for everything you did for me." Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing, his mind spinning as he processed the words. "You're alive." he whispered, his voice filled with awe. The woman laughed a little, nodding. "Yes, I'm alive. Because of you," she said. "You kept me awake. You didn't let me slip away. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Thank you so much." Jack didn't know how to respond. The weight of her words settled over him like a blanket, and for the first time since the crash, he felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. Everything he had done, everything he had been through, it had all been worth it. Hearing her say that made every moment of fear and doubt fade away. He smiled a little, feeling a warmth spread through him. "It's nothing really," he said. "I just did what I could." The woman shook her head. "No, it was more than that," she said. "You saved my life." Jack felt a rush of emotion swell up inside of him, his throat tightening with something he couldn't name. He had saved a life today, and the realization made his heart swell with pride and relief. He smiled again, feeling the weight of the day finally starting to lift. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for telling me. I'm just glad you're okay." The woman smiled and nodded before turning to walk away. But before she did, she turned back to him. "I'll never forget what you did," she said. "You're a hero." Jack didn't know what to say, but as he watched her walk away, he realized something important. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was someone who had made a difference in the world, someone who had stepped up when it mattered most, and that realization made him feel like he could face anything. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, they were all gone now, and in their place was something far stronger: hope, a hope that he had the strength to handle whatever came next.